Chapter 22, Fighting for the Four Freedoms, World War II, 1941 to 1945. Parts 3, 4, and 5. Part 3. Dreams of post-war prosperity united New Dealers and conservatives, business and labor, and they were promoted by two of the most famous roadmaps for the post-war world. The American Century, published by magazine magnate Henry Luce in 1941 to mobilize Americans for an imminent war, asked Americans to prepare to become the dominant power in the world and distribute to all peoples their magnificent industrial products and great American ideals, particularly their love of freedom. Luce believed that American power and values would secure unprecedented prosperity and abundance, all created by free economic enterprise. The idea that America had a mission to spread democracy and freedom had its origins in the American Revolution, but this idea traditionally saw America as an example to be emulated, not an active agent imposing an American system on others. To some left critics, Luce's appeal seemed a call for American empire. Henry Wallace, a liberal New Dealer, former Secretary of Agriculture for FDR and FDR's vice president beginning in 1940, responded with "The Price of Free World Victory," an address in May of 1942. Wallace anticipated that Allied victory would establish a century of the common man and that the march of freedom would continue after the conflict. Wallace argued the globe would be governed by international cooperation, not any single power, and governments would humanize capitalism and redistribute economic resources to end hunger, illiteracy, and poverty. Luce and Wallace defined freedom differently. Luce envisioned a world of free enterprise, while Wallace sought a global New Deal. But they also both believed America should intervene in the world by spreading abundance and posing as a model to other nations, and they ignored the other nations' visions of post-war world. When Congress dismantled parts of the New Deal, liberal Democrats and their left-wing allies planned for a post-war economy that would enable all Americans to enjoy freedom from want. In 1942 and 1943, the National Resources Planning Board, or NPRB, outlined a peacetime economy based on full employment, a larger welfare state, and an American standard of living. Emphasizing economic security and full employment, the NPRB called for a new Bill of Rights that would include all Americans in Social Security and guarantee education, health care, adequate housing, and employment. Liberal New Dealers, labor, farmer, and civil rights groups and churches welcomed the NPRB's plan, whose promise of full employment and fair income distribution seemed to one liberal magazine to represent the way of life of free men. The reports showed that liberals were moving away from trying to reform capitalism to attaining full employment, social welfare, and mass consumption without much direct government intervention in the economy. They were influenced by John Maynard Keynes, who argued government spending best fostered economic growth. Although war production had ended the Depression in a kind of military Keynesianism way, the NPRB proposed a continuation of Keynesianism in the post-war period. An increasingly conservative Congress opposed the NPRB plan and cut the agency's funding. In 1944, FDR, who knew that most Americans wanted a guarantee of employment after the war, called for an economic Bill of Rights. While the original Bill of Rights limited government power to secure liberty, this expanded government power to secure full employment, a minimum income, medical care, education, and decent housing for all Americans. FDR declared that the true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence. But his replacement of Vice President Henry Wallace by Henry Truman of Missouri suggested that he did not want to confront Congress over social policy, and Congress never enacted the Economic Bill of Rights. In 1944, Congress did enact the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or GI Bill, which extended to millions of returning veterans benefits such as unemployment, educational scholarships, low-cost mortgages, pensions, and job training. The GI Bill greatly shaped post-war America. It prevented post-war economic disruptions and sparked a boom in education and housing, which led to massive suburbanization. But Congress went no further. A proposed full employment bill that would have been a GI Bill for non-veterans, guaranteeing employment and requiring the federal government to increase spending if the economy itself did not produce full employment, was watered down before it passed in 1946 and did not require full employment. The bill's failure confirmed the political stalemate initiated in the 1938 elections and marked the return of respectability for the idea that economic planning endangered freedom. In 1944, Friedrich A. Hayek, an Austrian-born economist, published The Road to Serfdom, in which he argued that government planning threatened individual liberty and leads to dictatorship. When war production seemed to have restored capitalism and fascism showed the dangers of combining economic and political power, Hayek's book gave a new justification to opponents of the activist state. Hayek claimed that no person or set of experts could ever know enough to intelligently direct a complex, modern economy, and that the free market's scattered impartial knowledge more effectively ran economic life. While Hayek accepted some social policies, such as minimum wage and maximum hour laws, and a social safety net that guaranteed minimal citizen welfare and opposed traditional conservatism's love of authority, he helped establish modern conservatism by equating fascism, socialism, and the New Deal, and associating economic planning with a loss of freedom. Part 4. World War II changed Americans' vision of themselves as a people. The fight against the Nazi Empire and its theory of a master race discredited ethnic and racial inequalities. The cultural pluralism of ethnic and racial minorities in the 1920s and the Popular Front in the 1930s was now promoted by the government. It argued that the United States differed from its enemies in its commitment to the principle that Americans of all races, religions, and national origins could enjoy the four freedoms. Racism was the doctrine of the enemy, while Americanism meant tolerating diversity and equality. By the war's end, the new immigrants had been accepted as loyal ethnic Americans rather than members of inferior races. World War II brought the new immigrants and their children together with other Americans, drawing millions from urban ethnic neighborhoods and rural areas and mixing them in factories and the military. This patriotic assimilation was a stark contrast to the coercive Americanism of World War I, in which the Wilson administration made Anglo-Saxonism a cultural norm. Roosevelt embraced cultural pluralism as a basis of harmony in a diverse society, and the government promoted Americanism as equality in opposition to Nazi intolerance. Public officials rewrote the past to define American identity as free of racial or ancestral considerations. Repulsed by Nazi ideas of inborn racial differences, biological and social scientists discarded the belief that race, culture, and intelligence were linked. Even Hollywood depicted soldiers as a motley force of men from diverse regional, ethnic, and religious backgrounds who placed national loyalty above other identities. Bigotry certainly remained part of American life. Anti-Semitism still contributed to the government's refusal to offer refuge to more than a handful of European Jews escaping the Nazis. But the war made millions of ethnic Americans feel fully American for the first time. The war had a less definite meaning for non-white groups. Before Pearl Harbor, racial barriers were still intact. Southern blacks were confined by segregation, and Asians could not emigrate to the United States or become naturalized citizens. Mexican Americans had been deported during the Depression, and most American Indians still lived in deep poverty on reservations. But the war started changes that would impact the post-war period. Under the Bracero program launched in 1942, tens of thousands of contract laborers migrated from Mexico to the United States to work as domestic and agricultural workers. The program, designed as a temporary war measure, lasted until 1964 and brought a total of 4.5 million Mexican workers into the country. The Braceros were assured decent housing and wages, were not citizens, and could be deported at any time. The war also offered opportunities to second-generation Mexican Americans to move and find work, and contributed to the making of a new Chicano culture that fused Mexican heritage and American experience. Yet the Zoot Suit riots of 1943, in which sailors and police attacked Mexican American youths wearing flashy clothing in Los Angeles, showed the extent of wartime intolerance. But the contrast between discrimination and wartime rhetoric of freedom and pluralism inspired civil rights activism among Mexican Americans, such as protests against employment discrimination. Roughly 500,000 Mexican American men and women served in the military. Even Texas, which long discriminated against Mexicans, passed a Caucasian Race Equal Privileges resolution recognizing Mexicans as white, but saying little of non-whites. The war also drew into the nation's mainstream many American Indians, thousands of whom served in the Army, left the reservations for work, not all of whom returned, and took advantage of GI Bill benefits. In contrast, Asian Americans' experience was a paradox. More than 50,000 children of immigrants from China, Japan, Korea, and the Philippines fought in the Army, mostly in all Asian units. With China as an ally, Congress in 1943 ended exclusion and established a very small quota for Chinese immigration, but many Chinese moved out of ethnic ghettos to work alongside whites in war industry. Japanese Americans had a very different experience. While many Americans viewed the war in Europe as an ideological conflict with Nazism, Americans and Japanese viewed the Pacific War as a racial war. Japan's propaganda portrayed America as contaminated with ethnic and racial diversity, as opposed to the racially pure Japanese, while the attacks at Pearl Harbor stirred long-standing anti-Asian prejudice. Government propaganda depicted the Japanese as animalistic and subhuman, and blamed Japan's aggression on racial or national characteristics. Most Japanese Americans in the mainland United States worked on farms in California, and while one-third were first-generation immigrants, the majority were Nisei, American-born citizens, many of whom spoke only English and had never been to Japan. Though the government mobilized German and Italian Americans in the war effort and arrested few of the non-naturalized among them, it viewed every person of Japanese ethnicity as a potential enemy. The military, facing an explosion of anti-Asian sentiment and fearing an invasion, persuaded Roosevelt to issue an order in early 1942 that expelled all persons of Japanese descent from the West Coast. 110,000 men, women, and children, two-thirds of whom were American citizens, were removed to internment camps far from home, where they were confined in an environment of military discipline and surveillance. Internment demonstrated how easily war erodes basic civil liberties. No court hearings, due process, or writs of habeas corpus challenged the internment, which was supported almost universally by the press, the Congress, and public opinion. The Supreme Court upheld the policy, arguing that an order applying only to Japanese was not based on race. Yet internees were asked to buy war bonds, sign loyalty oaths, and consent to being drafted into the Army. In contrast to the treatment of Japanese Americans, wartime rhetoric of freedom helped spark significant changes in the status of blacks. While Roosevelt denounced theories of racial mastery, Nazi Germany cited American segregation to support its own policies. Yet segregation and racial violence persisted. The war stimulated a massive migration of blacks from the rural South to cities in the North and West, but they faced intense hostility, especially in Detroit, where a 1943 fight led to a race riot that killed 34 people and led to a hate strike of white workers against black employment at a war production plant. Lynching continued unabated. Nevertheless, more than 1 million blacks served in the armed forces in segregated units, limited mostly to construction, transportation, and other non-combat duties. Many northern black draftees were sent to the South for military training, where they resented the discrimination they faced and a better treatment given to German prisoners of war. When Southern black veterans sought the benefits of the GI Bill, they faced discrimination that sharply limited their access. While the GI Bill did not discriminate in its health, college tuition, job training, or other benefits, local administrators in the South curtailed, eliminated, or segregated these benefits to blacks' disadvantage. The modern civil rights movement was born during the war. Resentful of the nearly complete exclusion of African Americans from jobs in the booming war industries, black labor leader A. Philip Randolph in July of 1941 called for a march on Washington to demand defense jobs, an end to segregation, and an anti-lynching law. Randolph, who founded the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and fought the racism of unions and employers, criticized Roosevelt's inaction by using FDR's rhetoric, declaring racial discrimination undemocratic, un-American, and pro-Hitler. The march idea alarmed Washington officials, and to prevent it, Roosevelt issued an executive order that banned discrimination in defense jobs and created a Fair Employment Practices Commission, FEPC, to track compliance. Armed only with investigative powers, the FEPC could not enforce the anti-discrimination order. But its creation signaled an important shift in public policy. The FEPC was the first agency since Reconstruction to fight for equal opportunity for blacks, and it helped obtain jobs for black workers in industrial factories and shipyards. By 1944, more than 1 million blacks worked in manufacturing. During the war, the NAACP's membership rose from 50,000 to 500,000. The Congress of Racial Equality, founded in 1942 by an interracial group of pacifists, held sit-ins in northern cities to integrate restaurants and theaters. In early 1942, the Pittsburgh Courier used the phrase that embodied black attitudes during the war. The double V, victory over Germany and Japan, it argued, must be accompanied by victory over segregation in America. Black newspapers and black critics identified the gap between the Roosevelt administration's celebration of American ideals and the reality of race. During the war, a left-based but broad coalition called for an end to racial inequality in America. African American and Jewish groups campaigned against discrimination in employment and housing. Despite resistance from many white workers, CIO unions, especially those influenced by leftists and communists, tried to organize black workers and win skilled positions for them. Although AFL unions continued to discriminate, CIO unions were far more racially integrated. The new militancy among blacks scared moderate white Southerners, who now stood between blacks protesting segregation and Southern politicians who defended white supremacy and the South's freedom to shape its own race relations. The war that sparked modern civil rights agitation also generated politics that anticipated the massive resistance to desegregation in the 1950s. But in the North and West, many liberals openly called for a transformation of race relations. Some changes occurred. The National War Labor Board banned racial wage differentials, and the Supreme Court outlawed all-white primaries, which had enabled Southern states to disenfranchise blacks. By the end of the war, the Navy ended segregation and the Army had established a few integrated units. The new interest in the status of black Americans was evident in An American Dilemma, published in 1944 and written by a Swedish social scientist, Gunnar Myrdal. While his book depicted an America deeply affected by racism in law, politics, economics, and social behavior, Myrdal also showed appreciation for what he termed the American Creed, a belief in equality, justice, equal opportunity, and freedom. He argued that the war exposed to Americans more than ever the distance between this creed and racial inequality. By urging the federal government to follow American principles by banning racial discrimination, he established the liberal position on race relations in post-war America. By 1945, racial justice was integrated in a liberal left agenda that sought full employment, civil liberties, and a larger welfare state. Many liberals now demanded anti-lynching laws, an end to segregated schools and housing, and the expansion of Social Security programs to cover agricultural and domestic workers. The internationalism of black radicals in the early 19th century was revived in the early 20th century, partly in reaction to a new global rule of white supremacy across national lines. Garveyism and the meeting of 5 Pan-African Congresses between 1919 and 1945 that brought together black intellectuals from across the world to denounce colonialism in Africa helped foster this new global consciousness. Black American leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson met future leaders of African independence movements such as Kwame Nkrumah in trips abroad. Together, they identified the struggles of black Americans with black freedom struggles throughout the world. They argued that racism had started in the slave trade and slavery and persisted in colonialism. Freeing America from colonial rule, they thought, would foster freedom in America. Chapter 22, Part 5. In early 1945, Allied triumph seemed inevitable. Hitler momentarily pushed the Allies back in France with a surprise counterattack that created a huge bulge in Allied lines. Though the Battle of the Bulge was the largest single battle ever fought by the U.S. Army and inflicted 70,000 American casualties, the German assault failed, and by March, American troops had crossed into Germany. Hitler killed himself, Soviet troops took Berlin, and on May 8th, VE Day, Victory in Europe, the war against Germany ended. U.S. forces in the Pacific moved closer to Japan after retaking Guam and the Philippines in 1944, and a decisive naval victory at the Leyte Gulf. In the 1944 presidential election, Roosevelt defeated Thomas E. Dewey, Republican governor of New York, and won an unprecedented 4th term. But FDR died on April 12, 1945, before the Allies secured victory. His successor, Harry S. Truman, immediately faced an extraordinary decision: whether to use the atomic bomb against Japan. Truman, not knowing about the weapon project before becoming president, was told by the Secretary of War that the United States had built the most terrible weapon ever known in human history. The bomb was the product of Einstein's theory of relativity, which led scientists to use uranium or man-made plutonium to create an atomic reaction that could generate enormous power, which could be used for peaceful purposes or to generate a colossal explosion. Fleeing Germany for the United States, Einstein warned Roosevelt that the Nazis were trying to build an atomic weapon and urged Roosevelt to do the same. FDR launched the Manhattan Project, the top-secret program in which scientists during the war developed an atomic bomb, which was first tested in New Mexico in July of 1945. On August 6, 1945, a U.S. plane dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. It virtually destroyed the entire city and killed 70,000 immediately. 140,000 more died from radiation by the end of 1945, and thousands more died in the next 5 years. 3 days later, the U.S. dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki that killed 70,000. The same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. Japan quickly surrendered. The catastrophic number of civilian casualties caused by the bombs have ever since made them controversial. Japanese forces fiercely resisted Americans' advance in the Pacific, and Truman's advisors warned him that an American invasion of Japan may cost the lives of 250,000 or more American troops. But the United States did not plan to invade until 1946, and there were signs that Japan was close to surrender. Japan indicated that it would surrender if Emperor Hirohito retained his throne, but this did not meet Allied demands for unconditional surrender. In the end, the Allies let him stay. Some scientists who developed the atomic bomb asked Truman to use it just to show its power to other nations. Truman never hesitated to employ it. The use of the atomic bomb represented a logical endpoint to the way in which World War II was fought, namely, at great cost to civilian life. Compared to World War I, in which 90% of deaths were military personnel, in World War II, 20 million of the 50 million who died were civilians. The Nazi regime had systematically killed its enemies, including millions of Jews, and bombed London and other cities. The Allies in turn bombed German cities, such as Dresden, where 100,000 civilians perished. In March of 1945, nearly the same number died in the U.S. bombing of Tokyo. Although the war and government propaganda led many Americans to dehumanize the Japanese and few criticized Truman's use of the bomb, public criticism aroused by images of civilian suffering mounted. During the conflict, meetings between Allied leaders outlined the architecture of international relations in the post-war period. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met in Iran in 1942 and at Yalta in the Soviet Union in 1945 to develop agreements. The last Big Three conference occurred at Potsdam, outside Berlin, in July 1945 and involved Stalin, Truman, and Churchill. 3 Allied leaders created a military administration for Germany and agreed to try Nazi officials for war crimes. None of the 3 great Allied powers entirely trusted each other, and each vied for geostrategic advantage. The Allies' decision to delay the invasion of Europe cost many Russian lives on the Eastern Front and incited Soviet resentment, but their sacrifice persuaded Britain and the United States to allow the Soviet Union to dominate Eastern Europe. At Yalta, Roosevelt and Churchill barely protested Stalin's plan to control areas of Eastern Europe that had been part of the Russian Empire before World War I. Stalin agreed to enter the war on Japan later in 1945, include non-communists in the pro-Soviet Polish government, and allow free elections there. But Stalin intended to make Eastern Europe communist, and soon the Allies disagreed over the region's fate. Churchill also resisted U.S. pressure to move toward national independence for India and other British colonies, and he made separate private deals with Stalin to split Southern and Eastern Europe into separate spheres of influence. Britain also fought American efforts to control the post-war global economy. Delegations from 45 nations that met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in July of 1945 replaced the British pound with the U.S. dollar as the main currency for international exchange. During the Depression, FDR took the United States off the gold standard, but Bretton Woods again forged a link between the dollar and gold and set other national currencies at a fixed rate in relation to the U.S. dollar. The meeting also created 2 U.S.-dominated financial institutions. The World Bank would provide money to developing nations to help rebuild Europe, and the International Monetary Fund would prevent government from devaluing their currencies for trade advantages. Bretton Woods created the structure of the post-war global capitalist economy that made goods and investment more free and recognized American dominance of world finance. American leaders asserted that free trade would encourage world economic growth, an assumption that continued to govern U.S. foreign policy. In 1944, near Washington, D.C., the Allies also found a successor organization to the League of Nations. The new United Nations, or UN, would consist of a General Assembly of Nations where each member nation had an equal voice and a Security Council tasked with maintaining world peace and security. The Security Council had 6 rotating members and 5 permanent ones: Britain, China, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States, each with the power to veto resolutions. In June of 1945, 51 countries meeting in San Francisco adopted the UN Charter, which outlawed force or its threat as a means for settling international disputes, and the next month, Congress endorsed it. The war radically redistributed world power. The major military powers of Japan and Germany were defeated. Britain and France were weakened, while only America and the Soviet Union could still project their own power on the international stage. The United States essentially became the dominant nation in the world. But international harmony did not follow the peace. Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe soon helped spark the Cold War, and the atomic bombs inspired much fear across the globe. Allied rhetoric of freedom was not always followed in post-war policy. In 1941, Winston Churchill and FDR issued the Atlantic Charter, which assured that Nazi Germany's defeat would be followed by free trade, self-government for all nations, and a global New Deal. It specifically embraced freedom from want and freedom from fear, but left out the other 2 of the 4 freedoms in deference to British colonial rule in India, where Britons preferred not to grant freedoms of speech and worship. The 4 freedoms of the Atlantic Charter were intended to solidify world opposition to the Axis powers, but it also laid the foundation of human rights and inspired colonized peoples to adopt the language and ideals of freedom and national self-determination and use them in their struggles against the victorious Allied countries, causing more conflict and future wars.